100 years ago, the world was very hopeful that the slaughter of World War I would come to an end. And indeed, a few months later, in November, there was the armistice, the end of World War I. However, the bad news nobody had anticipated, including those who had survived in the trenches and so on, was that the largest epidemic of modern times would hit the world, the so-called Spanish flu. The Spanish flu, which killed more people than the whole of World War I. And interestingly, whereas World War I is in our collective memory, my grandfather took us every year to the trenches, to the poppy fields in Flanders, where he had spent 3-4 years. I'm from Flanders, Belgium. But the Spanish flu is not remembered collectively, not as a historic disaster. And that's a quote from Laura Spinney, a book I can highly recommend, and that's called Pale Rider, about the Spanish flu and how it changed the world. When you look at it, just here some fairly basic statistics. You can see that there was a huge peak in mortality coming in actually 3 waves, starting in March 1918, and then a second much worse wave in autumn, around the armistice, and then a third wave, as you can see here in 1919. And it was devastating. Devastating also because it hit not only the people who normally or usually die from influenza, elder people, but also it was killing disproportionately young people, young adults. Again, the ones who came from the front. Now, why is it called the Spanish flu? There is a certain tendency in history, in people, to always blame others for a problem. For some reason, historic reason, Naples is often blamed for all kinds of things. Syphilis, gonorrhea, also the influenza. Actually, in Spain, they called it the Naples disease. And because of the war, there was very heavy control, censorship of news, of the media. There were no social media. So it was fairly easy to organize censorship. And any bad news was not allowed to be published. So even if it started, the first, cases came from, actually from Kansas in the US, that, in March 18, this is where the first known case occurred. You can't find any trace of this in the popular media. But Spain was not a party in World War I. So there the media were, were fairly free. And so they were publishing about outbreaks in various Spanish cities, and so it became the Spanish flu. But each country had a different name. But just in Japan, and in Japan, the first victims were sumo wrestlers, the very one. And so it was the sumo disease, the sumo influenza. And each country in Poland, it was called the Bolshevik influenza, etc., etc. That in itself makes an interesting book, and how how diseases are being named. But basically, what's the bad news? You blame the others. Now, also, this was at the time when there wasn't disease surveillance. There was not something like here, Public Health England. There was not even an understanding what the etiology, what the causes of influenza. It was thought to be Pfeiffer's bacillus, which is a bacteria and which we know is not the cause of influenza, which is a viral disease. So it was not so easy to come up with a definition or to know exactly what what a disease, how to define it. And here you can see that one thing that we know, and that is that it spread all over the world. And you can see here the first wave in blue, then the second wave, and then we had a third wave. And just remember, there was no commercial air travel in these days. So in no time, a virus spread all over the world, where the fastest mode of transport was the train. But the movements of troops and also the demobilization afterwards helped. And mass gatherings and celebrations of the armistice and so on, and religious festivals, and just name it, all that contributed. But I still find it remarkable how fast a virus could spread all over the world just by air, because people have to breathe, in the absence of the kind of travel that we have now. And so between 50 and 100 million people were killed. You can say, wow, that's a big range. And the reason for that is that there was no systematic recording of deaths in most countries. The definition was not clear, and so on. But we know for sure that in some parts of the world, and particularly when an island was affected by it, up to 20% of the population could die. And one example is the Western Samoa, where about 22% of the population died. And you have it also not only in the South Pacific, but you can see here the enormous number of people who died all over. The UK, 250,000. Now, that was the immediate impact. Massive deaths. Hospitals couldn't cope. Cemeteries couldn't cope. And it destabilized society, but in a very acute way. Once it was over, kind of life went back to normal, kind of, but not really. Because the Spanish flu had long-term impacts, as most epidemics. The economic cost was huge, but on the positive side, it really woke up governments that, okay, we've got to do something. We have a responsibility, for health. And that's kind of where the many European countries, particularly, that public health systems were built and were developed. Many orphans were left, millions and millions of orphans. And also, interestingly, it really nurtured a whole culture, a cult of nature living, healthy lifestyles, which was then afterwards captured by Nazi ideology and by communism. So all this made that the Spanish flu had an incredible impact on society. The responses were, in these days, were not based on much of scientific evidence, even if the germ theory had been demonstrated by Pasteur and Koch and so on, several decades before in the 19th century. It was not yet commonly accepted. And also, it was not so clear how this virus people didn't know it existed, was transmitted. But some things made sense. Isolation, quarantine, but like this hospital that you can see here, actually probably also contributed to the spread of it, because it's a mixture of people who actually have it and others no. And something that also appeared, and this is for an image from Japan, where today in Japan and also in some other Asian countries, when someone has a cold or so, people walk around with a face mask. That started in these days. So that's interesting that the origin of it is not to protect yourself, but it's in Japan today's you want to protect others. Whether that's effective is debatable, depends on what it is. So there was a massive but very uncoordinated approach, and it led to, as I said, the birth of a lot of modern public health systems. Should also say that most people, actually we know today, died from complications, from pneumonia, from bacterial pneumonia. And the big difference with today is that there were no antibiotics then. Today we can treat most of them. And why was there this Spanish flu? Why was this so lethal, so fatal? We know it's an influenza virus, and an influenza can be, got all kinds of types. It's a virus that mutates all the time, and it's of the so-called H1N1 type, but of a completely new type, so that nobody had any protection, no protective immunity, because the reason that every year we need a different influenza vaccine is that the virus has mutated a little bit, and so that we need a vaccine with the new antigenic makeup, the new coat and so on, that will then induce antibodies against the new strain. And when that's a completely different new strain that we have absolutely not been exposed to, that's when you can have this fatal and massive epidemic. Now, epidemics have always been there, and we've seen the Asian flu, Hong Kong flu, Russian flu, avian flu, swine flu, and so over the years. And actually, every year, we shouldn't forget that influenza kills tens of thousands of people. That's kind of so-called normal. But what may become the biggest epidemic of modern times is still going on, and that's HIV, and I'll come back to that. Already more than 30 million deaths. Now, epidemics, okay, my background is microbiology, infectious diseases, and I've always been fascinated by epidemics, by microbes since I was a child. But it's also catching the interest now of people dealing with investment and with risks. And here, this is from the annual report of the World Economic Forum. They publish every year a very interesting report. It's called the Global Risks Report. It's from January this year. And it's based actually on surveys, what people think and believe there's a risk. And epidemics are always in there. So together with social instability, food crisis, water crisis, etc., cyber attacks, and just name it. So they have now, they're no longer just in the field of public health and of microbiologists. We also know today that the economic impact of epidemics can be huge. And it's always as close to art as science to estimate what's the global impact in economic terms. But yet, it's fairly precise when, for example, we had SARS. This is the first major new epidemic of this millennium. SARS stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome. It's a virus, I'll say a few words about that appeared in southeastern China, and then in Hong Kong was really devastating. There, the impact could be measured in a very quite precise way. And so you see, we're talking about billions, and a huge, new Spanish flu type of epidemic would cause trillions of damage. Most actually of the economic cost is not so much caused by direct impact of the epidemic. I mean, that's more medical cost and all that, and lives lost and so on. But it is the fact that epidemics destabilize society. And in the case of Hong Kong, for example, GDP was hit, by about 3%. But, tourism went down by more than 60%, tourism and all visitors. Food and transport and so on. And this is what's happening. Now, of course, it's not just us human primates who are affected by epidemics. Farmers know this very well. And I like wine, so wine is also, there's been a defining epidemic caused by phylloxera, also about, more than 100 years ago, and which wiped out the vineyards on the old continent in Europe, and fortunately they had planted some vines in California, so we could re-import that, and without that we would not have our good wines from Europe. But animals, so epidemics are there all the time, and it's not just limited to people. So, and their economic impact can be enormous. And it's one of the reasons, for example, that antibiotics are so widespreadly used in animal husbandry and for economic reasons, and with sometimes very negative impact on people. Now, I mentioned SARS epidemic in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong illustrates what we are going to increasingly be confronted with, and that is very high density populations, dense populations, like in Mong Kok, for those of you who have been in Hong Kong, is the most densely populated place on Earth. I can't remember the number of thousands of people per square kilometer. And that's where the SARS virus, which is a coronavirus, is a whole family, a new family that we know, and it probably comes from bats that are really living happily with the coronavirus. But when the virus is then introduced in a very dense population, this is ideal and it can spread. But secondly, not only did it hit Hong Kong very well, but someone traveled from Hong Kong to Toronto in Canada and caused then a new wave of epidemics there, killing tens of people in intensive care units and so on. And that's a big difference with the time of the Spanish flu. Even if I said, okay, it spread all over the world in no time, today that's a matter of hours and not of days. Travel that used to go by boat, I don't know what would have taken to go from Hong Kong to Toronto in 1918, but that was probably more a matter of, I don't know, a week or so, or more than that. You got to cross the Pacific Ocean and then go by train through the Canadian prairies and so on. So that's one. There was the first one where we saw, okay, it's no longer a local issue we need to care about. Other example is MERS. It's another coronavirus infection that comes from camels, and it's spreading in the Middle East. ME is Middle East respiratory syndrome. And here a Korean businessman flew from Abu Dhabi to Seoul, capital of Korea, and didn't feel well, went to an emergency room, in the waiting room, was examined, etc. And then does something that is quite common in Korea, is medical shopping, and so went from one hospital to another, and that caused the death of about 50 people. And I'm not saying the person is guilty, but that's through overcrowding in waiting rooms and in intensive care units. Again, it's an epidemic that continues in the Middle East, the Gulf states, but then it could hit Korea. And then finally, these are all transmitted through air, through breathing, basically. But then something happened that was also unexpected. A few years ago in Brazil, there was an epidemic caused by Zika virus. Now, Zika is the name of a forest in Uganda, near Entebbe. It's actually owned by the Medical Research Council. Because in the 40s, in 1947, a virus was isolated from monkeys in the Zika forest by the Uganda Virus Research Institute while they were looking for, the ecology for the spread of yellow fever vaccine. And by accident, they found this virus. And it was a virus without disease, and, as there are so many viruses. And it took then about 70 years before it was clear that this was also a major risk to health. And it caused a huge epidemic, first in the Pacific Islands, but then particularly in Brazil. And the biggest problem was, not so much for adults, because it gives you dengue fever-like syndromes. In other words, a bad influenza plus skin rash and joint aches and so on. But if you're pregnant, the babies born from mothers who are infected with Zika virus, particularly during the first trimester, are born with neurological complications and microcephaly, so small brains, small heads. Just like we've seen, we had here with rubella, German measles, before there was a vaccine. Today, we don't know this anymore, thanks to vaccines. There's no vaccine against Zika. The big difference with the previous epidemics is that this is transmitted by a mosquito. By a mosquito called Aedes aegypti, that is also transmitting yellow fever, dengue, chikungunya, and because of climate change and warming, it's spreading, its field around the world. Now Ebola, because Ebola is something that I spent some time on, but also when you think of the two defining epidemics of our time, it's not influenza, which has killed so many people and still kills, but in the imagination, in the media, it is Ebola and it's AIDS. These are the two defining epidemics. And when I was much younger, in 1976, my life changed when I was training in microbiology in the lab in Antwerp. We received a blue thermos from Kinshasa, which was the capital of what was then called Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it contained 2 glass vials. There was no plastic, it was all in glass. And with a little note asking, is this yellow fever? And it was blood from a Catholic missionary, a nun, who had died with what they thought was maybe yellow fever. And we did the usual things to isolate viruses. These days it was more like cooking. It's like very artisanal. You inject mice, you put it on cells and so on, and then you wait, and then you look on an electron microscope. And what did we see under the electron microscope was this image. We had never seen this. So we had to go to the library. This for the younger people. There was no, we couldn't Google or whatever. To go to a library, and then you had to, if you know what that is, and then and go and then consult an atlas, with images and photos of viruses. And we were lucky that we had all that in the institute I was working in, the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp. And we saw that this looked exactly like Marburg virus. Now, Marburg is a city in Germany where they have vaccine manufacturing plants. And we're making a polio vaccine, and a few years before, about total of, I think it was like 30 people in Marburg and in Yugoslavia, the then Yugoslavia, had died with Marburg virus infection while they were manipulating monkey kidney cells that had been infected with Marburg virus coming from Central Africa. So we thought it was that. And then there was a moment of panic, and we got a telegram from the World Health Organization saying we should stop all research, all investigations with these viruses, because we did not have the containment. I mean, And we sent it here in London to Portendown, and where there was a military lab with maximum security, what we call now BSL-4 level. And there were only 4 labs in the world these days. 3 were military, 1 in the Soviet Union, 1 in Fort Detrick to the US, and 1 here, Portendown. And then 1 civil one, that's at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. And it's in Atlanta, at the Centers for Disease Control, that they could demonstrate this was not Marburg, but it was a new virus. So they really confirmed this was new. So that was exciting, but I was particularly curious to know, what is this virus doing to people? How is it spreading? And so on. And by the way, the name Ebola is, because viruses need a name, is the name of a river that is flowing not too far from what was the epicenter of the first known Ebola outbreak in northern Congo, northern sea. And it all started around a mission hospital, you can see here, and the canary in the mine, in a sense, were 5 missionaries, Belgian missionaries, who died with this. They were caring for patients, the women, and the priest who had been caring for the death. And I'm mentioning that because it's such a remote area that it may not have been, without them, we may never have known. We arrived there. I had never been to Africa and had 0 experience in, investigating epidemics. So why on earth did I go there? I was excited because I saw this as a great opportunity, and there were not that many people who were eager to go, and there was not it's not like today where we have a core, like this country, we have a rapid support team, we had volunteers during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. So I could go, and this is the kind of protection that we had. It was very primitive, a paper gown, motorbike goggles, and latex gloves, and that's it. And yet we couldn't really care for patients. We tried to do that, but we wanted to, to do a few things. One, in an epidemic, the most important type of information that you need is to know what's the cause of the epidemic and how is that pathogen, virus, microbe, whatever, transmitted. Is it through water, food, insects, sex, blood, air, direct contact? I mean, the usual ways that viruses are transmitted. And that was our number 1 priority, because otherwise you don't know what you have to do. And that was the situation in the Spanish flu 100 years ago. People didn't really understand it. Secondly, in science, you always need confirmation. We had 1 isolate. And so we needed more samples from other patients to confirm that this was indeed, that virus was associated with this disease. We also, of course, needed to take care of patients as much as we could, but there was not much we could do, frankly. Lastly, was of course so-called stop the epidemic. That was these were our terms of reference, to use that bureaucratic term. It was also you try to define an epidemic in terms of 3 questions: time, place, and person. Time, how is it evolving over, what's the epidemic curve? For example, we go to a picnic, particularly with this kind of weather, and the cream is contaminated with staphylococci. By midnight, everybody's on the loo, and it's a very acute type of epidemic, or norovirus, and so on. Case of HIV, slow spread because it's sex and all that. And here, this is what we saw. And we arrived, actually, to be totally transparent, around here. So when the epidemic curve was going down, in other words, the epidemic was already going out, which is the best time to come in an epidemic as an epidemiologist, because people may think that it's thanks to your work. But But then ideally you want to come here. But that means, because then you can prevent that it goes up like to these peaks. But that was not the case because very remote area and so on. And so that was important to know. We wonder, okay, why did it go down here? And what happened around this time, about a week before, is that the hospital in this remote area had been abandoned by patients. People had said, people dying in the hospital, they said there's something wrong with that hospital. And that was also confirmed in other ways. One is that 11 out of 17 hospital staff had died. Two, that the closer you would live to the hospital, the more likely that you had Ebola. And we also found that there was an excess of pregnant women and of women who had just delivered. And it turned out that all of them had gone to the hospital, to the antenatal care unit, or that delivered there. And so all this put together without any computers or whatever, and some very primitive statistics, led us to identifying the mode of transmission. Because what was clear is that you needed very close contact with a patient with Ebola. And that was, in a sense, good news. Not so much for healthcare workers or family members, but that meant that the risk of major spread was far more limited. And, but in addition to caring for a patient and having close contact, there was something else that we found, is that attending a funeral was very risky. And the reason is that at a funeral, in the local culture, people really take their time to say farewell to their loved ones. It's actually a moving ceremony, a ritual, and something that in our cultures we've forgotten. We just don't want to deal with death, and it's left to professionals to clean the body and so on. There, it's done by the family. Now, that's very moving, but it's very risky, because someone who dies with Ebola is covered with, often with blood, not always, but certainly vomitus, diarrhea, so in other words, full of virus. And that is a very risky moment also. The one thing that we did not find in these days was that it's also sexual transmission. So that came later, that came out of the work in West Africa years later. Now, since '76, there have been many outbreaks, all in Central Africa. In red you have Ebola, and in blue Marburg, related viruses. So around Congo and Gabon and Uganda and so on. And that was the dogma was, this is a Central African thing, because the virus reservoir is most probably, we still don't know for sure, is a fruit-eating bat. And by the way, bats are very special animals from a biological perspective, and they hardly ever develop cancer. They can harbor all kinds of viruses that kill in no time other animals. So their immune system and their system for repairing their DNA, and so our DNA is constantly, being degraded and so on, is very remarkable. I don't know much about bat biology, but I've read a lot about it, and it's absolutely fascinating. We should study bats much more. But then everything changed in 2014, when there were the first reports, and there was in March 2014, that there was Ebola virus infection in West Africa. And I was in 3 countries, in addition, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. And it started in, we know today, around Christmas in 2013, in a town called Kekedu, in a border town in Guinea, Conakry. But the borders are very artificial. They come from colonial times, but people are, crossing the border all the time. They have relatives on the other side of the border. They marry with someone, etc. They're straight and so on. And the roads are quite good, which is a big difference from Congo. And it took about 3 months to know that this was Ebola. So first case on the 23rd of December, we know today. and laboratory confirmation was on the 21st of March. So a lot of precious time was wasted. Now, Liberia and Sierra Leone just came out of very brutal civil war and leading to not only a collapse of society in general, but also professionals left the country, infrastructure not there, and so on, so labs. Guinea, decades of corrupt dictatorship, similar problem, similar results. And also, you can only find what you're looking for. Nobody was looking for Ebola in West Africa, but for other things. So it was actually in Institut Pasteur in Dakar, in Senegal, that they could prove that this was Ebola. And then there was some, a bit of support and all that, but not really much. And you can see how the cases started to build up in May, June. And I remember in early July that I was interviewed by Christian Anampour of CNN, and I said, this is this is completely different from what we've seen before. 3 countries involved, capital cities, were only, quote unquote, 600 cases, but I said, this is different. This requires a state of emergency and special measures, because we've never been confronted with it. And after that interview, I told myself, I'm a Flemish guy, I'm just not supposed to create panic, so usually we kind of try to, just stick to the facts. And I wonder, maybe I exaggerated, but unfortunately, this is what was required in order to stop this epidemic. And it's only in August, so 8 months, 5 months after the diagnosis, that the World Health Organization declared that this was a public health crisis. And that is there's a specific term that then triggers international support and all that. And that was a clear failure of global governance that will have dramatic consequences. And the first question that we thought was, oh, maybe it's Ebola, but maybe this is a different strain. Because Ebola has different types of Ebola. And some are more lethal than others. And maybe we thought, okay, there's one that we didn't know that popped up. But today, unlike in 76, we can know in a few hours, at most a day, whether a virus is identical or not from another one that we know. And so you can do, through gene sequencing, we knew very rapidly on that this was a classic so-called Zaire strain. So it was not a new virus. And this is from an editorial in Science magazine. And so I said, this is really, it's about society and populations. It was a perfect storm. It was a perfect storm, a virus that was unknown. People had no experience with it. But entering countries that were not prepared for any shock. Liberia, for example, had 51 registered physicians, for a population of about 5 million. Sierra Leone, a few more. Guinea, much more. No infrastructure. Also, a total distrust of what authorities would say. When you come out of civil war and the government says we have an epidemic, people say, oh, maybe because we were in the opposition and we were, and they want to do that, they have an agenda and so on. Also, norms and beliefs about transmission of disease were also very different. And then the great delay in action. In epidemics, what's crucial is act early. And the reason is because, by definition, people are always infected by somebody else. So if you can prevent the development of an epidemic very early on, you're not only preventing the next case, but also the several generations. And that's what did not happen. And it led to major social unrest because life came to a standstill. Okay, hospitals were closed, women who had to deliver, nowhere to go. You break your leg, have an accident, life goes on. No care. But also schools are closed, university was closed, commerce came to a halt. At some point there was harvest season, the farmers couldn't sell their commerce. And to make things worse, airlines stopped flying into these countries. And so that was also a major disaster. And, the countries are living, the main economies, they're driven by mining, and the price of commodities was going down, etc. So it was really a major social issue, an economic issue, and some people were even killed during these riots, and also journalists and nurses who were going to come to work were killed. Now, at the end of the day, the epidemic stopped. 11,000 people were killed, thanks to heroic efforts from people on the ground, local people, but also major support from elsewhere. And the UK was really at the forefront. We concentrated on Sierra Leone for historic reasons, Americans on Liberia and the French on Guinea. That's still part of history today. And we had lots of volunteers coming through Public Health England to nurses and doctors and so on. And in the end of August, early September, I sent a note to an email to all staff at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I said, this is a crisis going on, a humanitarian crisis, public health crisis. It's our duty to support, and I encourage everybody to volunteer. And we had in 48 hours more than 400 volunteers. We were then about 1,500 people, and it was my proudest moment, because I know that people are here for a reason. Not everybody could go, of course, but it was people from the IT department, from communications, of course, from the labs, and so on. And when you think of it, epidemics, what do you need? I mean, it's the medical care, sure, but it's coordination, it's logistics, it's communication. That's why also the armed forces were so important to contribute and to come in. And that was the case in Sierra Leone with the UK armed forces, and in Liberia, the Americans. Now, a silver lining on all this was that for the first time ever in such a dramatic outbreak, there was actually some research was done. Social science research, with mathematical modeling and so on, but also, therapeutic and vaccine-related research. So we could evaluate, are some of the experimental therapies, do they work, do they protect? And the answer was, in general, either no or we don't know, because the sample size was too short, too small. But the major, I think, advance was particularly on the vaccine field. Thanks to actually funding from anti-bioterrorism funding, particularly coming from the military in the US, and also from in Canada from the Public Health Service, some experimental vaccines existed. GSK had one, Johnson & Johnson, and Merck. And the Merck vaccine was evaluated in Guinea, in so-called ring vaccination, where the vaccine was given through contacts of someone with Ebola, and then it was a trial design. Our school developed a trial design, and it demonstrated that it was really highly, highly effective to stop the spread of Ebola. And in Sierra Leone, our school continues to work on another vaccine that's particularly aiming at protecting healthcare workers and the general population, because imagine if you can protect a healthcare worker, you don't need to have this incredibly cumbersome, protective clothing and so on, and you wouldn't have this absolute disaster in healthcare workers. More than 500 were killed during the West Africa outbreak. 500 healthcare workers in countries that already have a shortage. So the lessons were that a perfect storm can generate major epidemics. Even in the past, it was smaller. 2, that you have to act early. Public trust is absolutely key. It's not a bunch of experts that's going to solve the problem if the public is not, doesn't have confidence. We saw new clinical features, for example, sexual transmission and all that. There was a real failure of global governance, but R&D was possible. Now, today, as we speak, there is an outbreak of Ebola going on, again in DRC. And I would say there's good news. One, being a swift response by the Congolese. It's one of the most disorganized countries in the world, I think. I worked there. But yet, they've got experience. They can make diagnosis in Kinshasa, and they act immediately, led by the Minister of Health himself. And the World Health Organization and MSF, Doctors Without Borders, were there, very proactive. The advantage was that it's in a very remote area, hard to reach when you see. That makes it tough to get there, but also it makes it tough to get out. You can only get with bicycles or motorbikes or helicopters. Even a four-wheel drive doesn't get there. And that means that it's been contained, and vaccines have been used for the first time. So I'm quite optimistic that we will see the outbreak coming to an end soon. Now, when you look at most epidemics in today's world, and we know that from the deployment of the Rapid Support Team of the UK, that are actually linked to humanitarian crisis. Yemen, where there's an absolutely bloody civil war going on, and not only civil war, but with lots of international players, there have been the largest cholera epidemic ever. More than 1 million cases. South Sudan, the same. When the Rohingya were massively displaced and killed in Burma, and went to Bangladesh, there was big outbreaks of diphtheria and other vaccine-preventable diseases, indicating that they had not been protected. So we can expect more and more because with the increase in humanitarian crisis. Now, the final epidemic I'm going to talk about before trying to answer the question, are we ready, is a new situation, and that is when an epidemic becomes endemic. Epidemic is when you see a continuing increase in cases. Endemic is that when there are new cases and it stays more or less at the same level, it's simmering. And that's the case for HIV. HIV came out of the blue and the first cases were diagnosed in 1981. 6 gay men in California. And it was thought to be a gay disease, which I never understood why a virus would care about the sexual orientation of a human host. Because what's the purpose in life of a virus? It's finding a host so it can survive. And the sex between humans is, that's the way to do it in this case. So all of these 6 or 8 initial cases, cumulatively 70 million people now, over 70 million people have become infected, all connected with each other. Because only sex can transmit it, or contact with blood transfusion, sharing of needles, or because your mother had it when you were born. And that gives a new idea of blood relatives, and also of what's going on in the world. More than 70 million people connected underground. And it really got out of control, particularly in some African countries. But there was a massive response. It really, around millennium, gave rise to what we call today global health, a combination of activism of people in our countries or in the gay community, but also, like in South Africa, here see, there were massive movements of people living with HIV. South Africa, which has now 6 million people living with HIV. And, and because in HIV, the time between infection and that you become ill can be as long as 10 years. So there's time to agitate. So we had massive mobilization became on the world's attention through the UN and so on. And I was then head of UNAIDS. The UN even created a body to coordinate the fight against HIV. And thanks to these massive efforts, and also a scientific breakthrough, because in 1996, it was shown that you can treat HIV if you combine 3 different drugs. And why do you need 3 different drugs? Because like influenza, it's a virus that mutates all the time. And so the risk that it becomes resistant if you give just 1 drug is enormous. But with 3, statistically, the risk is much, much lower. And that was changed completely the game in high-income countries. In the NHS, in September, these drugs were available. It was announced in July, so in 3 months' time, and people survived. It was no longer a death sentence. It changed how we looked at this epidemic. However, the price was far too high. It was about, in US dollar terms, $14,000 per person per year. And that was out of reach for most people in the world, where there isn't an insurance system or where they had to pay it out of pocket. And most of the patients were actually living in low and middle income countries. And here you see that how the price of these drugs of a 1-year treatment in Uganda dropped from $12,000 to what it is now, about $300, in other words, $1 a day. And that's something that I became absolutely obsessed with, that to lower that price, but also at the same time making sure that innovation continues, because we need new drugs, because resistance is developed. And so over the years, the number of people on therapy went up, and we are now well above 20 million. And these 20 million people would have been dead without these drugs. Hence the headlines, the end of AIDS, and the UN even said that by 2030 the epidemic will be out. Don't believe that. That's not going to happen. There are major achievements, but no successes. You see a decline of 50% in mortality, new infection going down, but still 2 million new infections per year in the world. 2 million, including here in London, although it's also gone down. So we are getting in a situation where it's no longer that epidemic, but we see every day the same level of infections. Now, what do all these epidemics have in common? Ebola, influenza, HIV, and that is that they're so-called zoonoses. A zoonosis is an infection that affects us, but it comes originally from other animals. And HIV comes from chimpanzees originally. You see bats that are the reservoir for quite a few viruses, coronaviruses and probably Ebola. Influenza, there's a whole panoply of animals from, particularly poultry, where the virus is living in and can mutate, recombine, and then when it jumps to people, that's when you get these epidemics. So these are zoonoses. And that's why, even if we are being quite successful in bringing down infectious diseases in general, people in our countries die from cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and so on, and cancer, not from infections, although it's sometimes pneumonia that is the final hit, in old age particularly. But it is a combination of urbanization, so high-density populations, enormous mobility, climate change that increases the spread of several insects, mosquitoes that transmit diseases, infections, conflict, deforestation, food demand, population growth. All that makes that we will be exposed to more and more of these emerging infections. The risk is getting bigger. And then there is one man-made type of epidemic that we are confronted with, and where, let's say, the UK, particularly led by Dame Sally Davis, the Chief Medical Officer, and Lord O'Neill, they've drawn the world's attention that there is a real threat of antimicrobial resistance because of overuse and misuse and abuse of antibiotics, which would mean, if this materializes, that we are confronted with untreatable infections. Now, what about the future? Okay, going towards the end. When I was in my final year in medical school, I went with something that we call today career counseling, but I don't think the term existed then. And it's And I wanted to work on infectious diseases and infections. And my professor said, no future in infectious diseases. Don't we have antibiotics? Don't we have vaccines? Don't we have sanitation? And it was also thought in these days that you could not treat viral infections, because in order to kill the virus, you would have to kill the cell, in other words, the host. Today we know that that's wrong. And yet I went for it. But after the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014, there was an outbreak of panels to review what went wrong. And I co-chaired one with Harvard University, and we all came to the same conclusions. And the conclusions was that the first thing that's most important, one, that there will be more epidemics, the risk in the world is increasing, but that the most important thing is the local capacity for early detection and early response. It's not the global response that we see in the newspapers and all that. And, but that's not there, so we have to invest in that. That WHO, the World Health Organization, was not fit for purpose and needed to become far more agile, responsive, and so on. That we need to engage with people on the ground. I mean, all this is not rocket science, but that's the way. There was also really bad behavior by scientists, by public health organizations, not sharing samples, not sharing data in the midst of an epidemic, which is vital to have very rapid and real-time information. And finally, that we need a system for developing therapies and vaccines where there's no market incentive. No pharmaceutical company is going to make big money with a vaccine against Ebola or whatever. There's no market. And yet, in this case, certainly, I mean, J&J, Merck, and GSK all invested in this, with knowing very well that they're not going to make much profit out of it, or no profit at all, I would say. So what has happened since then? Have we made progress? The answer is yes. One, I think, very important is that this kind of epidemic, what's now called global health security, new term, is now on the top agendas of the G7, G20, World Economic Forum, and so on. So I think that's important, because also that may lead to money. We have also, the UK has established what's called UK Public Health Rapid Support Team. That is a hybrid between Public Health England, which is part of the Department of Health and Social Care, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, an academic institution, so that we can be deployed rapidly. It's now 12 people at the moment. They're in Congo, but and one of the concerns that that some people had was, what are they going to do in between two epidemics? The government was concerned that they would be paying people for doing nothing. But the reality is that they've not been without 2 weeks of an epidemic, and that actually burnout is now the biggest issue, because people have to go from here to there. So we're now expanding that to a network of volunteers, and they've been in many countries just in 1 year. Also, on the R&D front, good progress. We have the so-called Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, which brings together big pharma, governments, NGOs, small pharma, academia, and to invest in vaccines where there's no market incentive. And here are the priorities. And we put that together in a good year, which is also a record. Now, another issue that we have vaccines, we have science, and then paradoxically, we have also a growing, I could say even epidemic in some country, of skepticism towards science, vaccines, and part of fake news, which led to a collapse in vaccine coverage in quite a few countries. Here we had the Wakefield episodes, that we're over that, but there are others. And so the final question is, what is there going to be the next big one? If you give a talk like this in California, everybody knows the big one is big earthquake, which will wipe out Silicon Valley, among other things. But it will happen. We don't know when. And the same is true for a big epidemic of a respiratory virus, influenza, or another one that mutates all the time. And the risk is enormous. You know, we were 1.9 billion people in 1918. We are 7.6 today. Huge mobility, but we have epidemics, antibiotics, and we are much better organized now. So I think that the answer to the question is yes and no. The risk is increased, but I think we are definitely better prepared. But the key is to invest in countries. And this is the final slide. Like this is now 4 years ago, yeah, when for my 65th birthday, my wife Heidi and I, we went to where the first epidemic had happened, in Yambuku. I wanted to see what was happening in the meantime and so on. And after that first outbreak, there was a meeting hosted by the World Health Organization, and where many promises were made. We will never let this happen again. It's like after every war. Huh? We will strengthen the systems. We will build capacity. I mean, you can just make a whole list. And when we came there, it was really depressing. The hospital was in worse state than before. This man you can see there, Sukato, he's a survivor of Ebola from '76. He runs the lab. The only decent equipment is this microscope. This is the centrifuge. The people had no money, so they leave their bicycle to have drugs and so on. So the lesson is that that's something that we should not let happen. And this is why it's important that we have this international solidarity, to use that old-fashioned word, because in today's world, an epidemic, an outbreak 5,000 miles from here can affect us tomorrow. So thank you very much. If you want to know more, this is us.